I'm going to start off this talk, which is going to cover a bunch of different things, with a simple 3-question quiz. Multiple choice, favorite type of quiz, nice and easy. I want you to consider, for each of those questions, globally, how many people out of 10 have electricity at home? How many children out of 10 are vaccinated against measles? And across the entire world, how many girls out of 10 go to primary school? So I want you to take a moment, pick 3 numbers. You don't need to shout them out or anything, but just bear them in mind, because the answers are 8, 8, and 9. Now, I don't know how this compares to what you were expecting, but for many people, these numbers turn out to be higher than you might have expected. If these are surprising to you, then I highly suggest you explore some of Hans Rosling's talks. Hans Rosling was a Swedish global health professor who promoted better knowledge about the trends in global development. The big message that he had was that we live in a much better world than people tend to realize. Most of our knowledge about the world and the state of the world is rooted in things that were taught in the 70s and 80s about a very poor third world and a very rich first world, and there being a huge disparity. There are still a lot of poor people in Africa, but there's also a huge burgeoning middle class. Now, before I go any further with this talk, I want to give a bit of context about why I'm giving this. I have a good friend from university, who posted to Facebook about a year ago mentioning that he had decided to commit to giving 10% of his income to charity every year. And he was posting about this publicly because he thought it was something that people should talk about. I found this really surprising. I'd never heard anyone making such a bold commitment before, and it intrigued me. There was a particular book that he referenced, and so I went off and I read that book, and the same author had written another book, and I read that as well. And I ended up doing a bunch of research in this area, and this talk is me presenting that research and sharing the things which I've learned about. The 2 books which I'm referencing are The Life You Can Save and The Most Good You Can Do, by an ethicist called Peter Singer. And I'm also riffing off some of the ideas in Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And I'm pulling out other things. This is not a presentation just about those 3 books, but I'd highly recommend you all to read all 3 of these books. So one of the things I need to define up front for this talk is what is extreme poverty. And I mean extreme poverty in opposition to relative poverty. So extreme poverty is having not enough food every day. It means drinking dirty water and not having access to basic modern services like clean toilets and rudimentary healthcare. Life expectancy in rich countries is about 80 years. Life expectancy in the poorest of countries is 50 years. The World Bank defines extreme poverty on an income basis as $1.90 a day, and that's in purchase power adjusted dollars. So that means whatever you would have been able to buy for $1.90 in the US in 2011, that's the amount of goods or income around the world that is the threshold that's defined for extreme poverty. And for comparison, in the UK, if you're out of work, you have no form of income yourself, the government will pay you the equivalent of $13 a day while you're looking for work. So in the UK, there's no good reason why people should be in extreme poverty. We have real issues in the UK with relative poverty, but nobody should be starving and dying at 50 for lack of support. This is an incredible graph, and I'm not sure how familiar you all will be with the numbers that are presented here. So let me explain it and unpack it briefly. The gentleman in the background is Hans Rosling. This is taken from a talk that he gave. The bright blue line is world population. So back in the 1800s, that sat around 1 billion. And by the end of the 1800s, it hadn't climbed a lot, but by the end of the 1900s, that had climbed up to around the 4 billion mark. And before then, in the 80s kind of time, it had reached the 4 billion mark. The red line is the number of people in the world who live in extreme poverty. So by the time the world population had reached 4 billion, the number of people in extreme poverty was sitting at about 2 billion. This is a big deal. That's a lot of people in the world dealing with a lot of suffering. But the incredible story since then is that world population has continued to climb. We currently are at about 7.5 billion people in the world. But the number of people living in extreme poverty has plummeted. It's actually reached 1 billion people and is actually continuing to decline. This is an incredible achievement. The number of people in the world has rocketed up, and yet the number of people who are dealing with intense hardship is actually declining very, very quickly. The incredible reality we have is that the UN actually has a goal by 2030 to eradicate extreme poverty. This might sound unrealistic to you, but they actually had a previous goal that was set as part of their Millennium Development Goals that ran from around the turn of the millennium up until 2015, where they were trying to achieve a bunch of different goals. But one of those was halving extreme poverty around the world, which sounds like quite a bold target. But they actually met it 5 years early. In 2010, the world reached that point. We'd halved the number of people in the world who are living in extreme poverty. And the new round of goals which have been set, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, again cover a broad range of targets. But one of them is that by 2030, which is really not that far away, the UN is hoping to eradicate extreme poverty, which is really quite a substantial goal and one which is hopefully quite achievable. So I want to pivot away from that a little bit and ask a very simple question. The books that I was referencing are written by an ethicist, a moral philosopher, and so they tend to spend their time asking simple questions to understand how people think about the world. So I have a simple question for you. If you found yourself in a situation where you discovered that there was a child very clearly in trouble in a pond, that child is drowning, you look around, there's no one else around. You're standing beside this pond, there's a child in the pond, the child is drowning. You look down, you're wearing your wonderful new $300 shoes that you just bought. If you wade in, you can definitely save this child. It's quite a shallow pond, but children are small and apparently quite bad at getting out of ponds by themselves. What do? Do you save the child at the expense of your $300 shoes, or do you let the child drown? I mean, this is phrased in a very loaded way because it should be a fairly uncontroversial question. Of course you'll wade in and you'll save the child. But there are some interesting variations on this question that you can ask. What if there are 3 children? You look around, conveniently there are 2 other adults. You wade in, save one child, make it back to the shore, look around, the other 2 adults are doing nothing. Do you wade back in and save 2 more children? That's doing more than your fair share. At what point is it okay for you to step back and not help? And the more powerful question is, if you can save a life, doesn't matter if it's far away. Because that simple question I posed you a second ago is a situation that we all live with every day. We're just not aware of it. There may not be a child dying in front of us in a pond right in front of us, but there are people dying of completely preventable diseases and conditions all around the world that $300 that we spend on a pair of shoes or whatever the luxury item is, we could probably live without that luxury item, and somewhere there's someone in the world who could greatly benefit in exchange for that. There is a natural follow-up question, though, that if you take that argument to its conclusion, you help someone, but there's always someone more to help. At what point is it enough? At what point can you justify spending on luxuries for yourself and not helping someone with that extra $300 or whatever the amount of money is that you could spend on helping someone else? One of the takeaways I want you to take from this talk is that please don't concern yourself with the next person you could help. Concern yourself with the first person you could help. Because I think the problem that we have is not people who are wrestling with that decision of when do they stop. It's that too many people don't wrestle hard enough with that first question of when do they start helping. Also, conveniently, the numbers work out that we don't need everybody to be impoverished to make substantial gains in the world, and I'll come around to that as well. So how much does it actually cost to save a life? Well, the best estimates focused on helping people in the most cost-effective places, so we're talking mostly developing nations where the problems are very solvable, that we just need to actually go in and solve them, are somewhere in the range of $500 to $3,000 to save a life. That's through interventions like distributing mosquito nets so that people don't get malaria and die. It's things like distributing oral rehydration salts so that the very many people around the world who still get diarrhea, get dehydrated and then die, don't die. And then you can make an enormous difference to people's life for amounts in the range of $500 to $1,500 for things like corrective surgery to restore people's ability to walk after serious burns, or to fix issues like cleft palate, or to repair issues like fistulas, which can be caused during childbirth and which can cause people to be ostracized from their community for life. You can allow that person to be reintegrated into their community for something in the range of $500 to $1,500. A more focused example about the different costs that can be involved in helping someone. Dealing with blindness. In the UK, the total cost to train a dog and then the handler for a dog, the person who's going to receive it, to help someone who's blind is £45,000. The cost to treat advanced trachoma, this is a condition where the eyelashes grow inwards and scrape on the eye every time you blink repeatedly until you go blind, £8. Completely preventable cause of blindness. Still affects millions of people. I want to make it clear as I go through this talk that I'm not intentionally putting any judgment about which of these interventions is better. I want you guys to make informed judgments for yourself. I'm not saying that nobody in the UK should get a guide dog because there are people with trachoma who we should be helping. But you should understand that if you are supporting guide dogs, then for the cost of one guide dog, you could help thousands of people who have preventable issues with trachoma. So what influences whether or not we help these causes, whether we give to charities? So I think the biggest one is creating a culture of giving. Personally, I've never systematically engaged with charity. It's not a thing which my family particularly talked about. It's not a thing which my friends particularly talked about. And so when this one friend on Facebook made that post last year, it was really surprising to me. And it caused me to kind of take a step back and think about it. But historically, I've given maybe small donations when friends were doing fundraising, but nothing systematic. It's also important to recognize that there's a bunch of cognitive biases which systematically will influence your giving decisions. And I'm not going to go into all of them here, but please feel free to come up and ask me questions about them after the talk. I think the most interesting one for me is this futility one. There's been studies have been done where people are asked to donate to a cause and they're told, you will help one person. And then they vary something about the rest of the message. So it's, you will help one person and there are 10,000 people who need help. Or you will help one person, but there are 100,000 people to help. Or you will help one person, or there are 1 million people to help. If you're told that the total cause which needs help is much larger, you'll donate less on average in these studies. Because you feel like the cause is futile, that you can't really make a difference. But if the intervention, the help that you're giving is to save someone, it doesn't matter that there are more people to save. That person's going to be very happy to be alive, or to not be sick, or to have the critical operation that gave them their sight back, or whatever it is that you're funding. Focus on the good you're doing, not the many other people who still need help. This is an objection which I had initially when I started looking at this. I pay my taxes. I'm in favor of paying taxes. It's painful, but I understand the good that it does. And the government gives foreign aid, so surely this is something which is taken care of. And I guess, yes, a little bit, but the reality is that government aid is politically targeted. It does not go to the neediest. It goes to some of the neediest, and then quite a lot to the people who the government has some vested political or security interest in helping. And so to take a couple of figures as an example, back in 2006, out of the entire US foreign aid budget, 20% of it went to Iraq. 20% of the world's poor were not in Iraq in 2006, but the US had quite a big vested interest in helping that country. Across the entire OECD, that's the Organization of Richer Countries, only a quarter of aid from these countries go to the least developed countries. I couldn't find a good visualization for the UK, but this is from, I think it's the 2017 US foreign aid budget. The largest recipient is Afghanistan, primarily security assistance, then Israel, then Egypt, then Iraq, then Jordan, then Pakistan. Then you start getting into more heavily developmental assistance. But the amounts just aren't that large, and they're heavily skewed based on political priorities. if you want to do the most good, then giving to non-governmental organizations of your choice is a very effective way of doing that. So then the key question is, who do you actually give to? Because in practice, different charities can be easily an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude more effective than each other, or cost effective in whatever way you want to define that. I'm going to leave that ambiguous because it turns out there's a whole interesting debate about how do you weigh up saving someone's life versus curing blindness versus helping them walk again versus helping animal cruelty versus people. Sidestep that for a moment. I want to talk to you about the history of a movement called effective altruism. So this perhaps has its roots back in 2003. Out of MIT, there was a group called the Poverty Action Lab who were started, who were using randomized controlled trials to assess the impact of interventions in third world countries, trying to actually gather quantifiable evidence about whether doing particular things had the outcome that you were hoping for. Is it better, for example, to fund more teachers or build more schools, or to deworm the kids so that they're less sick so they make it to school more often? But I think a more pivotal point was actually in 2007 when Holden Karnofsky and Ellie Hassenfeld, who were working for a hedge fund, realized they had a lot of money and they wanted to give it to someone effective. And at the time, there was an organization that was systematically looking at charities and weighing up of the money that they took in, how much were they spending on end causes versus administration. That was it. That was the only thing they tracked. There was no investigation into how effective the different interventions were. There was just what's their overhead. And we've all seen headlines before about charities where you give them £10 and £9 of it goes into office admin and £1 helps someone. And that feels a little bit uncomfortable. But it's not obvious that a charity which does the reverse is fundamentally better. Maybe paying quite a lot in terms of choosing the right interventions is quite important. Maybe we should assess charities on what they do and specifically gathering evidence about how they try and help people. So that's what GiveWell was set up to do. And over the years since they've been established, they've been asking charities to provide evidence of the interventions which they're making and the impact that they have, and attempting to put together essentially cost effectiveness analyses. And all of their research is available on their website. It's really interesting reading. Even their top-rated charities, you read the actual reports, and in practice it reads along the lines of, well, it looks really good in this country, and this is how much we think it costs to actually save someone's life, but we have these concerns, and actually in this country there's some practical issues with distribution, and we're looking forward to getting some more data a year from now. It's all much messier than you might wish it to be. But I find that in a sense reassuring. In 2009, Will MacAskill and Toby Ord, a couple of Oxford philosophers, started an organization, Giving What We Can. They realized that with the amount of money they were likely to make over their lifetime, in fact not even over their lifetime, in the next year of their life, that they could probably live quite happily on 90% of that. That they'd still have a completely comfortable life, and that they could commit 10% of their income to a good cause. And that if they did that over the course of their entire life, that would add up to a lot of money. And that this wasn't likely to just apply to them, that there's quite a lot of people in that situation. So Giving What We Can was set up to do largely similar things to GiveWell in terms of assessing charities on an evidence basis, but also to encourage people to pledge to give a certain percentage of their income to charity over their lifetime. Will MacAskill, along with 5 of his friends, went on to start up a site called 80,000 Hours. That title is taken from the idea that very approximately, over the course of each of our lives, we have 80,000 hours to spend on our chosen career. This site seeks to answer the question, what's the most good that you could do with your 80,000 hours? There will now be a short interlude while I log back in. There we go. What's the most good that you can do with your 80,000 hours? Interestingly, one of the surprising things that they suggest is that you could go and work for a charity, uncontroversial. Maybe, if you've got the right skills, you should consider going and working for an investment bank. One of the things which they advocate for is the idea of earning to give. But if you have a set of skills that are unusual and highly rewarded, then maybe the best way of using them isn't working a relatively modestly paid job for a charity. It's for taking a very highly paid job where the other candidates for that job may not choose to give to charity, if that's an unusual choice, but you could take that job and then choose to commit possibly quite a substantial amount of money to charity. And then in 2012, the term effective altruism was coined and has come to mean the idea of evidence-based giving to charity, and also perhaps this idea of systematically giving perhaps a portion of your income to charity. So I promised that I would try and explain why you don't all have to give until you're impoverished, that actually it all works out quite well. So the book, The Life You Can Save, sets out the idea of essentially a progressive scheme for giving to charity. Let me explain this slide very briefly. So the idea is if you look at just the top 10% of US earners, so that's the people in the US who are earning over $100,000, you allow them to keep the first $100,000 of their income entirely for themselves. Don't touch that at all. Then for income above $100,000, you ask them to give a sliding range from 5% up to 33%. It's like a progressive tax scheme where the more you're earning, the more that you're giving to charity. But you'll note that the highest amount is 33%. So even at the super high end of the income scale, you're still keeping the majority of that income to yourself. So you're likely to still be very wealthy. Nobody here is being asked to be impoverished. But if you applied this to the entire US tax base, and those numbers are publicly available so you can work out how much money you could raise through a scheme like that, if you convinced that many people to give on that kind of basis, you'd raise $471 billion a year. But that's just a number. Like, what is that in context? I don't know whether 471 billion is a lot. It sounds like a big number. So let me put that in context. The entire US foreign aid budget in 2016 was $42 billion. The UK foreign aid budget in 2016 was $17 billion. The Giving Pledge, which is pledges from super wealthy such as Bill Gates, where I think it's their pledge to give away half of their income, might be more than that over the course of their lifetime. The combined net worth of all those people adds up to giving $365 billion once. The most interesting figure here is that a cost analysis was done for meeting all of the UN Millennium Development Goals, one of which was halving global extreme poverty. And the total cost of that in its most expensive year was figured out to be $189 billion a year. That's a lot smaller than 471. And so the key insight here is that in a world where the very richest gave a minority of their income, and we're still very rich, you could make enormous differences. So what's the minimum that I think that we could achieve in ADCS? I'm going to heavily caveat this slide. Everyone has their own financial circumstances and should make their own choices. I'm going to put some numbers up in a second, but this is all about personal choice. I don't know what debts you have, what dependents you have, what your circumstances are. This is just for illustration. Also, I've chosen some nice round numbers for the sake of easy maths, because maths is hard. So if you imagine that we have exactly 100 people in the centre who are each earning £50,000 a year, that would be a total wage bill of £5 million a year. Let's imagine that 10% of those people decided to give 5% of their income, of their total income, to charity, somehow survive on a gross income of £47,500 a year instead of £50,000 a year, and noting that post-tax giving £2,500 a year only costs you £1,500 a year. Then every year, we'd raise £25,000 a year. And I suspect that the people giving it would barely notice it in terms of standards of living. 10 years from now, we would have donated £250,000. Being super conservative about the earlier cost to save a life, the minimum number of lives that we would save would be, it would cost about £2,500 to save a life. And so every single person would be, say, who took part in this would be saving 1 life a year. So every year we'd be saving 10 lives. And after 10 years, we would have saved 100 lives. And that's the minimum. In reality, we might easily save quite a lot more than that because it depends exactly on how the costs end up working out. And to, again, just put this in perspective, £50,000 a year is actually the top 0.35% of the world in terms of income. And if you're paying 50k, if you're getting paid 50k a year, that means that you're already paying £13,500 of income tax and national insurance. Out of that £13,500 of income tax and national insurance, £162 goes to foreign aid. So if you choose to give £2,500, you're dramatically increasing the amount of foreign aid which you're contributing to, which is kind of significant. And the final caveat is that obviously, if you're not in a position to give financially, there are other options for you. Volunteer, give your time. There are lots of organizations who would love to engage with you and have your help. Some practicalities. How would you actually do this in a way that's tax efficient? You've basically got two choices. You either give it through payroll giving, which is super simple. You make a declaration that the charity receives £100, the cost to you is £60, assuming that you're a higher rate taxpayer. If you do it through gift aid, the same outcome can be achieved, it's just mildly more faff. If you want the charity to receive £100, you have to give them 80. They claim the extra 20, and then you can claim the other 20 back from HMRC, so it ends up being net the same.
Assuming you're a higher rate taxpayer.
Assuming you're a higher rate taxpayer. This is a really fun graph and takes a little bit of explaining. So I want to work my way through it. This is from a study that was done back in 2001. Along the bottom, we have income deciles split into, well, 10 parts because they're deciles. This is lifetime income. So the people who are in each of these buckets have similar lifetime income. The y-axis is the amount of money that the people in each of these buckets had at retirement. You'll see that there's a huge range. The bottom and the top are the 10th and the 90th percentile of how much money people had at retirement in each of these lifetime income deciles. The point of this graph, the surprising result of this graph, is that being rich at retirement is not anywhere near as dependent on your lifetime earnings as you might imagine. That there are lots of people who have very modest lifetime earnings who retire with quite a substantial amount of capital. And there's a bunch of people who have really substantial lifetime earnings and retire with really quite modest savings. Really interestingly, the paper that this graph comes from tried to control for all kinds of random occurrences that might happen that cause you to have some kind of financial shock. So somebody gets sick, somebody dies, those kinds of things. And the quote from the paper, "We find that very little of this dispersion can be explained by chance differences in individual circumstances that might limit the resources from which saving might plausibly be made. Thus we conclude that the bulk of the dispersion must be attributed to differences in the amount that households choose to save." The point of this graph is that it's not a question of the random things which happen to you in your life. It's not a question of the amount of money that you make. And it's a question of the choices that you make over the course of your lifetime will dictate, cumulatively, how wealthy you are at retirement. And by the same argument, the choices that you make over the course of your lifetime systematically will dictate how much good you do over the course of your lifetime. These things add up. And interestingly, a related paper in 2016 showed that small cues make enormous differences to people, that giving people little reminders about things like increasing savings will cause people to materially increase their savings. It doesn't take much to nudge people's behavior. So This talk has attempted to cover lots of things, so I'm going to close with a slide that attempts to gloss over that and pretend that I've presented a clear and logical argument. Let's just all subscribe to that illusion. So what I've covered is that the world is getting better, and this is a thing that you should know about and that you could engage with. I've tried to make the argument that morally, if you can, you should help others, even if they are far away. And it doesn't actually cost a lot to save a life or significantly help someone, but it's very likely that quite a number of you in this audience are in the position that you could live lives almost indistinguishable from the life that you live today, but also have afforded saving someone's life or significantly helping someone. Hence, you should consider giving to charity. If not now, over the course of your lifetime, have this as a thing that you reflect on. And that different charities have hugely different impacts. And therefore, it's really important to choose the right charity. And that cumulatively, there's enough wealth in the world to tackle hard global problems. That this is not an unwinnable fight. And in fact, even as you sit here, this is a fight that we're winning. The UN is hoping to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030. That's really exciting. As a result of doing all this research, in the name of talking about this stuff and talking about and making this a conversation which happens, personally what I'm doing now is I'm giving 8% of my gross income to the Against Malaria Foundation, which is the top recommendation of giving what we can and give well. They are very cost effective at stopping people getting malaria. So it seemed like that seemed like a worthy cause. There are lots and lots and lots of resources. I will be sending around these slides after the fact. There is a separate animal charity evaluators site if you want to find effective charities for helping out with animal suffering. If you've never been here to Hans Rosling's site, I would highly recommend it. Having an idea of how birth rates, death rates, life expectancy are changing around the world and over time, I think is kind of important.